Well, hello everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. I am going to be talking about Bloom's Taxonomy and building success in the classroom. And before we start, let's see. A little bit about me. I am a native Pittsburgher from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and have been here most of my life. I went away to the state of Connecticut for 20 some years and then came back to be closer to family. So I've been back in Pittsburgh for 10 years. I actually have more than 30 years experience, which I don't even know how it's possible. I must have sent you an old bio, Leanna. But of working with individuals with AAC, I've actually been specializing in AAC for my whole career. I found it to be very interesting when I was in graduate school and kind of gravitated in that direction. I have worked in public schools, in private practice, and in clinics. I've worked mostly with pediatrics, but have worked with adults as well. And I am an employee of Savannah Compaction System, as Leanna said. I lost my audio not too long ago, so I do want to Leanna, I'm going to bring my chat window up, and if I lose my audio again, just let me know. Okay. Let's see. There we go. So my hope is that today, after the webinar, you will be able to describe two differences between referential and descriptive teaching methods. I know that you spent an hour with Gail last week. For those of you who were able to partake in that particular webinar, what a great webinar that is. And I'm just going to do a quick recap of that. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, I know that you have access to it for I think 90 days. Definitely take the opportunity to listen in on that and view that, because it's really a powerful webinar. We're going to talk about the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy, and we're going to talk about some learning activities for each level of Bloom's. And so we are going to be looking, I'm just going to do a quick recap, as I said, of descriptive teaching. And descriptive teaching really emphasizes the use of core vocabulary. And I like to extend that slightly and say that it emphasizes high frequency vocabulary, because I believe that as we're talking about those everyday words that we use, some of them make that core list and some of them don't. They're just really high frequency words. So if we think about the advantages to using core and high frequency in a descriptive teaching model, some of those advantages are that core vocabulary is 350 to 400 words that are the most commonly used words in the language. And so they're already in the AAC device. You don't have to take the time to program them into your device for a given lesson. The core shows a 90% overlap from preschool through adulthood. And so, you know, there's not a lot of variation demographically or through age range with the vocabulary. So the words that our children are using at the preschool level, they're going to be using at their later education levels as well, like high school and even into college or university. And then prioritizing the use of high frequency vocabulary really eliminates the need to program that revolving vocabulary of curriculum words. And so we don't have to be worried about getting the lesson words into the device every day or every week, because we're going to be just approaching that whole challenge from a different angle. And so we're going to use the vocabulary that's already in the device rather than worrying about programming in the curriculum words. Okay, so when we shift from a referential model, which is what happens when we do add that vocabulary that's specific to each lesson. For example, I'm thinking of, let's say we're doing a lesson on constellations, right? And so we have to have, like, maybe the word, you know, the names of some different constellations in there. We have to have the word constellation. We have to have the word star, which is already in there. But we would be asking students, what do you call a cluster of stars that can be created into an image? And they would have to hit the button that says constellations. And so when we shift from doing that, we shift from having that lesson-specific vocabulary programmed into the device to a focus on our high-frequency vocabulary. That lesson-specific vocabulary is very temporary, because we'll do a unit on constellations, but then, next week or 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a completely different unit, maybe on the galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy or something. And so constellations no longer are so important. So we need new vocabulary such as galaxy and other, I don't even know, other words that might fit with that lesson. So instead of having that temporary vocabulary, we end up with high frequency vocabulary being used in flexible ways. So I can use the high frequency core words and really high frequency words over and over again in different combinations to create meaning very flexibly. In a referential teaching model, I have to answer a question as the learner. What do you call a group of stars that creates an image? And there's one word answer, right? It's constellation. Or I could have a short phrase response. But if I'm using a referential teaching method, then my utterances are, I can target a response with my learner or model language for my learner that's at a developmentally appropriate utterance length. And then with referential, if you ask me a close-ended question and I answer it, I'm either going to get it correct or incorrect. I'm either going to say a gathering of a group of stars that creates an image is a constellation, or I'm going to call it a galaxy and get it wrong, right? And so that's one of the challenges with referential is, you're right or you're wrong. When you're looking at it from the perspective of descriptive teaching and talking about a concept, there's more than one way to participate in the learning activity, and there's more than one correct response. So through descriptive teaching, the really important thing is we get to focus on language learning all day long in the curriculum. And this is super, super important for our early AAC users, our emergent communicators, because our kindergartners, here we start school at kindergarten at age 5 or even a little bit earlier, preschool. By the time they hit kindergarten, first grade, their language system is pretty intact, right? It's adult-like in its structure. The thing that changes the most once they hit kindergarten is their vocabulary explodes. Well, for our kids who need AAC, that's a completely different story. Very rarely do we have a child enter into the educational system already fluent in how to use their AAC system and already, having that adult-like language structure. And so we really need to make it a priority to focus on language all day long through school and in school. So with descriptive teaching, instead of asking closed questions, you might ask an open-ended prompt. You might say, tell me something you know about stars, right? And they might say, they look little, or bright light, or they might have, a greater level of language complexity. They might say, they are up in the sky. They are really big, but look little. But even with those two responses, I used a lot of high frequency vocabulary. We also ask open-ended questions. So I might say, what is a constellation? And then the learner could give me a description of what the constellation is. Has lots of stars, can make a picture, see at night, things like that. So what happens is that the student learns to use the permanent high frequency words that are in their system in flexible and meaningful ways. Okay. So with descriptive teaching, the goal is that our role as the clinician or the teacher is we still have to find the vocabulary that's important to each lesson and then identify descriptive definitions for each word that are comprised of these everyday words or core vocabulary. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I apologize if I'm bouncing. I'm going to be really honest with you and say that I just put this slide presentation together because I wanted to expand it a little bit. And this slide wasn't supposed to be in there, so I did not update it for constellation. I thought I had some examples here. But our emphasis is placed on teaching the student the concepts that are inherent in the curriculum vocabulary words and how to use core vocabulary to describe the concepts rather than, again, accessing that temporary vocabulary. So I spoke with Leanna about your learning standards, and she suggested that I just kind of move forward with talking about ours, and I'm not going to go into depth with ours. Our standards are called the Common Core State Standards, and out of the 50 states in the US, there are probably at least 40 that use the Common Core State Standards, and then there are some states that choose to use their own. The state of Florida has the Sunshine State standards, and the state of Virginia has their own standards of learning. But most of the states in the US do use the Common Core state standards. And so ASHA, the American Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, has a statement or position statement about the role of the speech language pathologist and their participation with the IEP and with Common Core state standards. And so according to Common Core state standards, each student with a disability should have an IEP which includes annual goals aligned with and chosen to facilitate their attainment of grade level academic standards. So I know that you all have students on your caseloads for whom achieving grade level academic standards in this academic year is not possible, right? Because there's a huge lag, there's a gap, and students with learning disabilities aren't always able to close that gap in a year. So I really appreciate what ASHA says. ASHA says, however, when setting goals and objectives for the IEP, speech language pathologists must use a developmental model and target skills that promote growth beyond the current levels of performance to the eventual attainment of those grade level standards. And so what ASHA is saying is that as speech language pathologists, we have learners that are coming in who don't have the language skills, that we target those skills developmentally. And I think that that just helps us as speech language pathologists to take the pressure off and say, yes, we know how we know language development. We know what that looks like. We know how to address that, even if it's somebody who's using an AAC system. So ASHA goes on to say that we have a direct role as speech pathologists in implementing Common Core state standards with students who struggle with language and literacy, but our role is also to support classroom teachers. And so for students who have severe disabilities, the SLPs may collaborate with the educational team to work on appropriate curriculum and functional goals to help the student reach his or her potential. And so one of the things that I see here a lot in the States, or I have seen especially more when I was living in Connecticut and I was a consultant in the school district, that it's really a challenge to write appropriate IEP goals for individuals who use AAC. So I am going to take a look at some of the standards, because I think we get confused about what the standards are saying and what the requirements are for our kids who use AAC. You know, the whole reason that we started talking about the standards and Bloom's Taxonomy in Pittsburgh during our Pittsburgh AAC language seminars is because we've had classroom teachers who are really concerned that if we did not do that referential approach, if we didn't add words like constellation and galaxy into the device, then they weren't doing their jobs and that the students wouldn't meet the standard. And so what I have here are just a couple of standards for us to look at and see what are the skills that we need to be able to exhibit and demonstrate in order to meet the standards. And so these are just a couple of standards that I pulled off of the website. And if you look at the part that's bolded out, those are the skills that the students are expected to know. So they're expected to be able to ask and answer questions to demonstrate understanding. They're supposed to be able to recount stories. And they're supposed to be able to describe characters in a story, their traits, their motivations, how their actions contribute to the story. They're supposed to be able to determine the meaning of words and phrases, refer to parts of stories or text, distinguish a point of view. They're supposed to be able to explain and compare and contrast. And so all of these skills, when you think about it, none of these standards are asking for the student to be able to list all of the stars in a primary galaxy, or list all of the, to state the key vocabulary in a reading text. What it's asking us to do actually is to use language. When we're being asked to, share a point of view, explain, compare and contrast, discuss, all of those things require language. So we have to be able to go beyond this kind of getting the academic and curriculum vocabulary into the device to target the standards. To be able, we have to go beyond curriculum vocabulary into language. Okay, so what I would like to do is just talk about how do we write academic goals with a language focus. And so what I have is just a couple of standards, and I'm going to read the standard, and then I'm going to, kind of show you a goal and a couple of objectives that I have developed around that standard. So for example, the first standard that I have is determine the meaning of general academic and domain-specific words and phrases in a text relevant to a grade 3 topic of subject area. So this is a grade 3 standard, and it's to be able to talk about the meaning of words and phrases, which really fits nicely into that descriptive teaching piece. But what is a goal? What is the goal of this standard? Is that the student will be able to define grade level academic and subject specific vocabulary. So again, our objectives are going to be student specific. So it really depends on where the student's language level is. And so it might look like this first objective, which is student will use core vocabulary to produce a 2-word description for 5 curriculum words within a lesson. And so I want to point out that these goals are measurable even though they don't target that kind of with 80% accuracy, right? Because sometimes we do want to target accuracy, but not for every skill. And so the goals that I have written in these examples do not target accuracy, but they target a number or another type of behavior in terms of being measurable. Let's say that the student is able to already produce a 2 or 3 word utterance, then our language goal for this particular objective would be something like the student will use core vocabulary to produce a simple 3 to 4 word utterance that defines 5 curriculum words within a lesson. So, in the first objective, somebody, who's talking about an ocean or describing an ocean might say big water. But in the second objective, the student whose language skills were further developed, they might describe an ocean as the biggest body of water or biggest kind of water. And so, again, that's just using that high frequency vocabulary to demonstrate learning. So here's a standard, and the standard is describe characters in a story, their traits, motivations, or feelings, and explain how their actions contribute to the sequence of events. So that's the standard, and so really the goal is the student can use attributes to describe character, settings, and events, right? And so an objective might be, again, student specific. Given a short passage, the student will indicate 3 characteristics of 2 different characters in the text. And so it might be, strong, mean, helping, or little, green, grumpy, right? But again, if my student's language skills are further developed, I might have the objective of, given a short passage, student will generate a sentence, subject, verb, complement to describe 2 different characters in the text. She is mean, or she liked apples, right? And so I'm targeting language while I'm still targeting the learning standard. I have a couple more in here, but for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip over to Bloom's Taxonomy. You guys will get a copy of the handouts, and so you can take a look at those other standards and goals on your own. But Bloom's Taxonomy is one of the ways that's widely used to organize levels of mastery for measuring student outcomes. And so Bloom and his team of psychologists had developed 3 different taxonomies, one for knowledge-based learning, one for skill-based learning, and one for affective educational goals. The one we're going to talk about today is the knowledge-based. And so, this actually got revamped in the 1990s, which seems like so far ago. It went from the 50s to the 90s, and now it's, 30 years later. But back in the 90s, they revamped it to make it more active. So the first tier used to be knowledge, and now it's remembering, and so forth. So it went from, and I don't remember what understanding was, honestly. Applying was application, analyzing was analysis. And so they were nouns, and so it's just making it more active by making them verbs. And so there are a lot of verbs that are tied into Bloom's taxonomy in terms of the learning at the different tiers. So when we look at the categories within Bloom's taxonomy, within the cognitive domain, they can be thought of as intellectual goals for learning. And each tier builds upon the skills in the previous levels, and it presumes mastery or assumes mastery of these previous skills. And so if we go back and look, we're saying that in order to demonstrate applying, I'm going to have mastered the remembering or the knowledge part of whatever this curriculum area is, or this lesson is. And I've also had to demonstrate understanding of that information so that I can begin to apply it. So the nice thing about Bloom's taxonomy is that it gets really helpful in terms of assisting in the development of measurable outcomes or goals. And so the learning objectives within a lesson are the Bloom's taxonomy levels are really helpful in identifying the purpose of any learning task. And it helps to provide a shared perspective for the teacher and the learning that we're targeting, an understanding activity, or we're targeting an application or evaluating activity. The taxonomy also provides a structure with which to target the range of cognitive skills. It helps us as the professionals to realize and remember, yeah, we do have to demonstrate remembering before we can demonstrate understanding, before we can demonstrate application. So it really helps us to structure our own instruction. And it does help to have an organized set of objectives. It helps classroom teachers to plan and deliver appropriate instruction, design valid assessment tasks and strategies, and it also helps ensure that instruction and assessment are aligned with the objectives by building into that structure. So when Gail did her webinar last week, she talked about a lot of different things, and she gave the example of a plant. And so I thought, in terms of applying Bloom's taxonomy and taking it sort of beyond that vocabulary level, what can we do in terms of Bloom's taxonomy if we're doing a lesson on plants? And so we're going to pick up that kind of plant theme from last week with Gail, and we're going to go through the six tiers of blooms. I got distracted for half a second. I want to make sure I have a time check here. Okay, so remembering refers to the student's ability to recall information that they have learned. And it is skills like, and these are the Bloom's verbs that I talked about briefly before: defining, duplicating, listing, memorizing, recalling, repeating, reproducing, state. And so we started talking about Bloom's taxonomy when somebody challenged us and said, you can't even get past the first level of Bloom's taxonomy without adding vocabulary specific to the lesson to a device. And I thought, why not? And then I saw this word, listing. In your chat, can you give me a thought about how you can demonstrate the skill of listing without programming the vocabulary into your device or your student's device?
The great silence reigns. Does anybody want to answer that in the chat?
That's okay if you don't want to answer. I can give you some thoughts about it.
The great silence. Lots of words on paper.
Words on paper, yeah. Type, yes, both excellent examples. And so if our child is literate, our student is literate, they can just spell those words to create that list, right, using the keyboard. The other thought is that lots of words on paper, so providing a word bank, right? And so even think about different ways to do a word bank. So it could be cards, words on cards, and you sort the cards that go on the list versus the cards that are excluded from the list. Or, you do have a word bank and you circle or cross out, based on whether you're excluding or including words. And I always like to say when we're talking about descriptive teaching and when we're talking about sort of these kinds of tasks where we need to have access to curriculum vocabulary, don't forget about low tech. And so it's okay to create a board, a manual communication board that has the vocabulary for a specific lesson on it. You're not taking the time to add it to the device, but you do have it for the child's ability to reference if they need it in the classroom activity. And so if they have to create a list, right, that might be one way to do it. Okay. And so here is, Gail showed a very similar worksheet last week. She showed a worksheet with the parts of a plant, right? And so one of the things that you could do with this particular worksheet is the student could, we're going to do vegetables today. And so we added one more piece of the puzzle from the plant last week, but they could draw lines from the stem to the word stem, from the fruit of the plant to the word fruit, from the root, right? And so, or I might cut these up because they seem like they're in order of the way they, you know, would appear, kind of, they're very close to their visual representation, I might mix them up a little bit and ask the child to demonstrate remembering by kind of putting them in the right spot, or maybe putting the word root on the root, or putting the word leaf on the leaf. So there's lots of ways that we can target these remembering tasks and adapt materials that are already made for our kiddos who are using AAC, so that we don't have to plant. And honestly, if you were to look in the Accent and in the Unity software, all of these words are in there. But I always say, if they're in there, and I heard Gail say in her webinar, if they're in there, use them, absolutely. But I also think about those really emergent communicators where I might not be wanting to focus on that specific vocabulary during this lesson because I might be targeting a different language skill. So in that case, I would still be adapting things. Understanding refers to the student's ability to explain what they've learned. And so it's skills like classifying, describing, discussing, explaining, and you can read the rest of them, you know, those skills. Paraphrasing is another one, reporting. But let's take a look at an understanding task. All right, now this is audience participation time. Actually, from now to the end, we're going to be doing audience participation. So what is the job of the roots in a plant? Think about how you would describe the role that roots play, and a way to demonstrate get food for plant. Exactly. Good. What else do the roots do? They get food. What else? They get water, right? And so if I can demonstrate that I understand the role of a roots by saying they get food and they get water, then I'm understanding that lesson, right? And so rather than asking the question, which part of the plant draws in nutrients or draws in nutrition, right? I ask, what is the job of the roots? Because it's a lot higher frequency to say get water and get food and help grow than it is to say the word root. And even if the word root is in there, again, if I'm building language, I want to target my child, my student, and my learner's ability to use those higher frequency words. Okay. Applying is the next level of Bloom's taxonomy, and it refers to the student's ability to use information in a new way. And so I always think of the applying piece, especially for our students, and especially when they're those early language learners, in terms of how does this apply to me, right? So the skills or the verbs that are connected with applying in Bloom's taxonomy are things like choosing, demonstrating, employing, illustrating, dramatizing, interpreting, scheduling, writing, solving, etc. So our applying task would be taking care of our own garden. So it might be talking about what are the things that we have to do to take care of our garden, right? And again, audience participation, if you were my learner, what would you say? I have to water it. Good. What else? I have to spend time. Good. Good. What do I have to do, Carly, when I'm spending time there? What are some things I might have to do? Fertilize, right? So give it food. I have to wait, give it water, take out weeds. Good. So, and that's what I was thinking of too, was taking out the weeds. Now, I don't think, and I've never looked, but I don't think the word weed is in the Unity software. So how would you describe a weed? Bad plant. Yep. Yep. Take out other plants, right? Take out bad plants, take out bad ones, take out bad green things, right? There's lots of ways, unwanted. Exactly, not wanted. Okay, very good. Okay, so all of this would be kind of them thinking about not want this one, not a good one, right? So great, thank you for your participation. I really appreciate it. So applying again is just taking this information, doesn't belong is great because it's all, those are really high frequency words. You guys have given me great examples. And applying is again, for me, making those connections about what can I do to make a connection with this lesson. The next level of Bloom's that we're going to look at is analyzing, and that refers to a student's ability to differentiate between components. And so that's appraising, comparing, contrasting, differentiating, discriminating, etc. And so if we were going to look at doing a comparing and contrasting task, let's say that we would compare and contrast you know, a plant with a tree. So I'm not going to take the time right now to write in the things that are just unique to plants and just unique to trees, or what's the same about them, but let's think about it. What are some things, if we were going to say, what's the same about plants and trees? What would you say? They both grow. Good. What else? They both need sun. Good. Have roots. They're green. They have leaves. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. Now let's take a look or give some thought to what's different. And I did see, Brigida, that you said, I hope I said your name correctly, that you said size, right? So that is one thing that's different. A plant is small and a tree is big, right? And so I might write on the plant side small and write on the tree side big. What else is different about a plant and a tree? The shape, yeah, good. Yep, the color can be different. Yep, the function, good. What they do. Bark, yeah, I was thinking that too. And I was thinking even like, you know, saying hard trunk, right? Or hard versus soft, or hard versus movable, how they grow. Yep, good. Lots of great things. Okay, and what they give us. Excellent. So you guys are doing a nice job of just kind of thinking about and doing this comparing and contrasting task, which would be a good analysis task. Okay, next we're going to look at evaluating. That's the fifth tier, and that refers to the student's ability to justify a position or a decision. So it's things like appraising and judging and supporting and selecting. And so let's go back to sort of making that connection. You know, let's say our task is to plant this vegetable plant, right? This carrot or this tomato plant. How are we going to decide where to plant it, right? We need to evaluate what is a good place to plant this. So what would you say would be important in terms of the environment that we put these vegetable garden plants in? They need sun. Yep, absolutely. Sun again, yep. In fact, we are getting ready in my backyard to cut down 2 trees. They've been around, gosh, it hurts my heart to think about it, 60 years at least. But it's because our garden gets no sun. And so they need space to grow. Yep, so they need sun, they need space, and they need good dirt, right? One of the things about my garden is that it's very much, the dirt is very clay-like, and so we have to really work our soil. So they need good dirt, right? But not too much water. Good. All right. So all of this again is evaluating what is important for the plant to have, what's important not for it to have. It has to be safe from animals. That's a great point. You know, we have to have a fence up around our garden to keep the animals out, right? And so all of those are really good points, and evaluating, thinking about that. Excellent. Okay. Thank you guys again for your participation. So creating refers to the student's ability to create a new product or a new perspective. And so some of the tasks involved with creating could be constructing, designing, developing, formulating, or writing. And so let's go ahead. We're going to do a quick idea web. I'm going to try to do this. I hope my camera doesn't get all wonky. I'm going to go ahead and have you guys give me some details about a plant, and I'm going to add them to the idea web. So what are some details that we know about plants? One thing that you guys already told me is that they grow, right? What else do we know? They need water, right? Need water. Let's try to get that in there. But they're pretty, they're living. They're living, not loving. They need sun. They're pretty. They need sun. They have leaves. They give us air. Did I spell that right? No. Give us air. Okay, good. So, and they make food. Excellent. So you guys have given me a lot of great things. And then what we would do with this idea web is that we would begin to organize, right? We could move this around, and there's lots of softwares that do this, you know, even for general ed stuff, you know, that help you to organize your idea web. And so there are different types. So we could organize our details and then begin to build some short phrases, or depending on the individual's language levels, we can then start to write into sentences. So that is kind of applying Bloom's taxonomy to, I have to close this for 1 second. Applying Bloom's taxonomy to the science lesson that Gail was talking about with plants. I want to take a look at applying Bloom's taxonomy to literature. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a story called Mrs. McNosh Hangs Up Her Wash. This would be an appropriate story for kindergarten, preschool level. And then what we'll do after I show you the story is we will go ahead and answer some questions about it. I'm going to come out here and go to here. All right. I want to make sure before I start, can you guys see my YouTube screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, awesome. So I am going to go ahead and maximize the screen and play. Okay. Now I'm going to get it up to the point of the story. So this is Mrs. McNosh Hangs Up Her Wash. I'm going to get to the very first page. Save us a couple seconds here. Okay. So each Monday at dawn, Mrs. Nellie McNosh brings out a barrel and does a big wash. She washes all morning, and when the sun's high, she hangs what she's washed on the clothesline to dry. She hangs up the dresses, she hangs up the shirts, she hangs up the underwear, the nightgowns and shirts. She hangs up the stockings, she hangs up the shoes, she wrings out the paper and hangs up the news. She hangs up the dog and his dish and his bone. She gets a wrong number and hangs up the phone. She hangs up a hat and an old wedding gown and 2 sleepy bats, which she hangs upside down. She hangs up a lamp and a large Christmas wreath and Grandpa McNosh's removable teeth. She hangs up a kite by the tip of its tail. The postman arrives and she hangs up the mail. She hangs till she's hung every last thing in sight, including the turkey she's roasting that night. Each Monday by dusk, Mrs. Nellie McNosh has finally hung up the last of her wash. She takes off her apron and lets down her hair and hangs herself up in a comfortable chair. All right, so we're going to stop that. It's a cute little story. And it's a pretty basic story. So when we think about the 6 levels of Bloom's taxonomy, how are we going to do that with this really simple preschool story? So I think it's really important for us to kind of walk through this together. Again, remembering is the ability to recall information that has been learned. So let's go ahead. I'm going to just open my chat back up. And I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions now that you've seen the story. First of all, what did Mrs. McNosh do all day? Wash. Yep, she washed. And hang. She hung up the washing. She hung stuff up, right? And do you guys remember what day is wash day? Monday. Yep, exactly. And so I always say that if I were in the audience, I would forget because I'm not one to pay attention to details. So I would fail that remembering task. But all of those answers that you gave me are just really high frequency, right? Just high frequency words. So what did she do all day? She hung stuff up, she washed clothes, right? And again, it depends on the child's language level. Understanding, again, is the student's ability to explain what they've learned. And so if we look at understanding from, oh, no worries, Kelly, thank you. So understanding is the ability to explain what they've learned. So we might have to say, what happens to clothes when they get hung up or when they're hung on the line? So what happens to clothes? What do you think? They dry, right? It's plain and simple as that. They dry, they get dry. Exactly. And so again, these are answers that you guys are giving me very naturally. You're not thinking, how can I simplify my response? It's just very natural because of the type of question that I'm asking you. And so really when we're thinking about descriptive teaching, or we're thinking about targeting learning at these different levels of Bloom, it's really about asking a different kind of question than we've become accustomed to asking our kids who use AAC. So another understanding task might be to sort these items into clothes and not clothes, because Mrs. McNosh hung up a lot of things. Some of them were clothing items, but most of them weren't, right? So differentiating, and I'm really not concerned if my learner at this point in time can tell me an animal, clothing, a reading material, a Christmas decoration. All I want them to be able to do is to distinguish clothing and not clothing and understand what would really go up on the line or be washed as part of laundry and what would it be. And you know, we had been using this book for quite a while when my colleague Tracy Kovac, who will be she and I will be presenting in June the webinars on the 4 pillars, and she said, you know, this book is full of nouns. It's full of fringe vocabulary. We had been using this book for about 6 months in our seminars before we even realized that, because we were taking the approach of descriptive teaching. So it really didn't matter that every page had this ton of nouns on it, because we weren't thinking about the learning from that perspective. Okay, let's go to the next one, and that's applying again, that ability to use the information in a new way. And I always, again, like to do that kind of text to self connection. And so, you know, Mrs. McNosh is doing a household job, right? And so we might ask our learners, what jobs do you help with at your house? And it seemed to me that Mrs. McNosh is a lot of fun, right? And so we could say, how can you make those jobs fun, right? And so, excuse me, students might say something like, I pick up toys, I make bed, I put dishes on table or set the table, things like that. Okay. Analyzing is the student's ability to differentiate between components. And so we might have to think it through. What do you guys think? Is it easier to wash something or to dry something, and why? The analyzing is the why part. It is easier to dry something, right? Katya, why would you say it's easier to dry? What would your reason be? You only hang it up, right? You just put it up, you only hang it, right? Exactly. Okay, need less things, absolutely. Especially if you're doing laundry the way Mrs. McNosh is doing laundry with the big barrel and the washboard, right? Okay. Evaluating is this ability to justify a position or decision. And again, appraising is one of those skills. So let's look at the postman running away, right? Why did the postman or the mailman run away after he gave Mrs. McNosh her mail? He did not want to hang up. Exactly. He did not want to go up on that line. And again, you guys are giving me really simple answers, you know, that are really appropriate for what our kids would say. And if I had a really early language learner, they may say not go up or not one up, right? Or just no up. would be an answer in the context that would make sense and would demonstrate sort of that the child understood the context. Okay. Creating is, again, the ability to create a new product or perspective. So in the case of Mrs. McNosh hangs up her wash, let's add one more page to the story. Somebody tell me what you think happens next. She's hung herself up in a comfortable chair. What happens next? She goes to sleep. Yep, sleep, goes to sleep. She's earned it, hasn't she? After all of that laundry getting done, she relaxes, right? We've had people say it rains. We've had people say she falls down, everything falls down. And so that's the creative part. She stops washing, yes. And that's the creative part, is that everybody comes up with a different answer, because, you know, think about your students and your learners. You know, when you give them that task, everybody has a unique perspective. Okay, we are going to do one more example because I want to take you through sort of a higher level text. I don't know if any of you have read the book Hatchet. I'm going to give you kind of a synopsis of it, and then I probably will have to answer some of the questions on my own. You read it in grade 5. Excellent, Eleanor. I think my son was in grade 5 or grade 6 when he read it, and I read it because it was so, he couldn't put it down. And so, yeah, it's absolutely a great book. You know what? Actually, last summer, I picked it up at the library and reread it because I thought I better make sure. I was doing this example in Bloom's Taxonomy all from memory. And I said, I better make sure I have my details right. So I did it. I read it in one night. It was so good. And it's, you know, clearly it's a younger child's book. So it wasn't any major feat that I read it in one night. But anyway, for those of you who don't know the story of Hatchet, it's about a boy named Brian. He's 13 and his parents are divorced. His mom and dad live in New York, but his dad is working in the wilderness in Canada for the summer. And so Brian, his dad's already up there, but Brian's going to go up and spend the summer with his dad. And so he has gotten the ability to ride along with a supply plane. And it's just a 2-seater, you know, the rest of the plane is kind of like a little cargo area. And you know, they're flying along, and the pilot decides, you know, that he'll let Brian, you know, he's 13 or 12 or 13, he's going to let him steer the plane. And so he teaches him how to steer and how to go up and how to go down. And, you know, it's all well and good, but then the pilot has a heart attack and he dies. And so all of a sudden, you know, Brian is trying to figure out, what am I going to do? The radio wouldn't work. He couldn't get anybody to help him. And so he realized, you know, in the course of things, that if he landed amongst the trees, that the plane would be broken up and he would not survive. So he put it in his head that I have to land on water. And so he did. As the plane ran out of gas and fuel, and then he kind of scoped out a lake and he steered towards the lake, and he was successful in landing on this lake. But he has to scramble off of the plane once he lands in the lake so he doesn't sink. And the only thing that he has with him when he gets off of this plane or out of this plane and scrambles to shore is a hatchet that his mom had given him when he was getting on the plane. She thought, since he was spending the summer in the wilderness, that a hatchet would be a cool thing for him to have, you know, as a 13-year-old boy. So that's kind of a synopsis of the story. And I'm going to take, I won't take my little detour quite yet, but, you know, if we were doing Hatchet in school, you know, grade 4, grade 5, there would be several activities and lessons built around the book, you know, because it would take a couple of weeks to read a chapter book at that level. And, you know, all of these activities would address learning and cognition within the tiers of Bloom's taxonomy. And so here's my little detour. I don't know if you guys know about Tar Heel Reader. It's tarheelreader.org. And there are some great resources on there. Now, it is a resource that is kind of consumer driven or user driven. It's free and anybody can post stories on there. So there's a lot of great stuff. There's a lot of stuff that's not great. But one of the things that this one author, Maureen D, has done is she has provided, it's almost like Cliff Notes in a book form. And so there are several stories that she's done, including Hatchet, that she gives us a little synopsis of. And so I show this to you to let you know it's a resource. And if your student is doing a book that she's done, then you can grab it and kind of simplify the text through that. But if you're doing a book that she hasn't done, think about contributing to the website yourself with a similar example. So this is her version of chapter 1. And it starts off with Brian was flying to Canada to visit his father. His parents were divorced because of a secret that only he knew. Brian's mother gave him a present. It was a hatchet. He strapped it to his belt before he left. The pilot let Brian sit in the co-pilot seat and fly the plane and practice flying the plane. It was fun until the pilot got sick and died. Brian was alone flying the plane. Would he ever see his parents again? And so that's chapter 1 in about 5 or 6 sentences. And I think that she does a great job of simplifying, for some of our kids who need to have the text simplified, it's a great resource. We're going to quickly go through Blooms with this, and then I'll go ahead and take a couple minutes if it's okay with Leanna, and we can field some questions or some thoughts. But again, remembering is the student's ability to recall information that they've learned. And so the whole book of Hatchet is about survival. So what is survival? Anybody have a thought about what survival is? Staying alive, right? Stay alive, keep alive, live, right? Okay, good. Okay, and then one of the things that was really important to Brian on day 1 was building a shelter. What is a shelter? Safe space, home, excellent. Safety, keeps you safe, safe place, excellent answers. Good, excellent. Now I can guarantee you that the word keeps you warm and safe is another great answer. I can guarantee you that the word shelter is not in the Unity software. And I'm pretty sure it's not in any of the devices that we would take a look at. But we can talk about it using the words that we do have, right? And so you guys, again, are giving me very natural answers because of the question that's being asked. Okay, like a house. Excellent. Okay, keeps us safe, keeps us warm and dry. It's like a house. Understanding is the ability to explain what they've learned. And so this one, without having read the book, would be a little bit hard for you guys to do, but how does the title represent the text? His mom gives him this hatchet. It's all he has to survive. And what he ends up doing is using this hatchet for everything. He uses the hatchet to help cut down the elements to make the shelter. And he uses the hatchet to cut the berries and to make the fishing rod and to catch the birds. And so he actually uses the hatchet for many, many different things. It basically helps him to live and stay alive. So it might be, and actually I just told you this, in your own words, how Brian survived by himself, right? So he had to get, yes, kind of like the AAC system. Retell in your own words how he survived by himself. He had to get food. He had to make fire to keep warm. He had to get water. He had to make a safe place to live. All of those things, again, are really high frequency vocabulary. Applying is the ability to use information in a new way. And we're not going to take the time to answer this one, but applying would be, what are 3 things that you would want to have with you if you were stranded and why, right? And so being able to say, well, I want water, and knowing that you need water because you need water to live, right? Or I would take matches, and knowing that you need matches so that you can make fire. Okay. Analyzing is the ability to differentiate between components. And so we're going to compare and contrast. So we're going to take a look at the kind of house Brian had when he lived with his mom compared to the kind of shelter that he made in the wilderness. And so we might say, what's the same about them? You can go in them, right? They have a roof, they have doors, but what's different is so much more, right? One is big, one is little. One is warm, one is not warm. One is inside, one is outside. And so there's lots of things in terms of comparing and contrasting that we could do to do an analyzing task. Okay. Evaluating is the student's ability to justify a position or a decision. And so Brian is thinking about this secret that he has during the whole book. He's thinking about the secret. He's really angry with his mom because his parents are divorced, and he's blaming his mom. And the secret is that he saw his mom in the car with another man, and she saw him kiss this other man. And he's pretty convinced that his dad does not know about this. So he's thinking about his mom. He's thinking about how upset he is with her, and he's thinking about whether or not he should tell dad the secret. And so if you were Brian, one question might be, would you tell dad the secret, and why or why not? And so for the sake of time, I'll go ahead and just say, yes, I would tell dad, he should know. Or I might say, no, it will make him feel bad. Or no, it's already done with. So those could be some of the answers. But again, with evaluating, you have to kind of justify it. And then creating is the ability to create a new product or perspective. And so from the Hatchet, we might say, write the ending of the story as if you were the man who rescued Brian. And so Brian, at some point decides he's going to go back onto this plane because he remembered there was a survival pack. He goes into the plane, he grabs the survival pack, he brings it back to shore, he opens it up, and there's a radio. He flips on the radio, and about 30 minutes later, a plane comes and it rescues him. So if I were the man who rescued Brian, I might say, I got a call. I went to see what it was. I saw a boy. He was happy to see me. I took him home. And of course, if my language learner was, developmentally a little bit less than that, then I would scaffold that to support the client. But those are just some, ways to think about using high frequency everyday language to address the curriculum. And I believe I have a summary slide. But if we think about the vocabulary of everyday life, it is dominated by our highest frequency words, those 300 to 400 words, 350 to 400 words that are really flexible and can be used to express nearly any concept. So core words must be used to teach curriculum content as well as for assessment, and it can be a primary tool by which students can learn and be evaluated within all the components of Bloom's taxonomy. So that is the content of the webinar for today. I didn't know if anybody had questions, or I'm happy to stay on for a couple minutes and take care of any questions.
Thank you, Debbie. That was great to hear about how you can apply Bloom's taxonomy. I've certainly got some ideas that I can try.
Excellent. Awesome. Thank you, Brigitte. You're welcome. Okay. Thank you. Excellent. Well, you guys are very welcome. It was my pleasure. And Leanna has my email if anybody, wants to contact me about anything. But okay, would I work through all the tiers with an emergent communicator? I feel many teachers put a cap to say they can't do the higher levels. That's a really good question. And I think that we are really guilty of that in our field, especially for our emergent communicators, to presume that they can't. And so I would say that I would build tier upon tier. And so if my learner can demonstrate remembering, right? If they can, contribute, like, let's go back to that plan. If they can demonstrate that, yes, this is the leaf and this is the roots and this is the stem, then I would naturally go to that next level, right? Because that's what all the other kids are doing. And so could we then, if they're demonstrating remembering, can we then target an understanding task? And, it might have to be scaffolded. So in the example of what is the job of the roots, we might have to give some examples of, what the roots do. Do they collect the sunlight or do they get the water? And give some choices there and scaffold it. But I think that you're right. I think that sadly, sometimes we limit our kids by our expectations rather than presuming that they have the potential. And I wouldn't say that, boom, 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 we're going to go through all levels of, all 6 levels of Bloom with every lesson right away. But that's our goal, right, is to be able to build towards that.